All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the future of housing policy and advocacy in Canada, brought to you by my organization, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, also known as CHRA. My name is Jacob Gorenkoff. I'm CHRA's Director of Policy and Government Relations, and I'm also the moderator for today's panel discussion. So my colleagues and I were absolutely thrilled to arrange for this lineup of powerhouses to deliver this discussion today and make it available to both members of CHRA and organizations that aren't currently members. So for those of you that aren't too familiar with us yet, CHRA is the national association representing the affordable housing sector. We conduct research, develop policy, run programs, and advocate for affordable housing as a key driver of creating a Canada that is fairer, more inclusive, and more affordable for everybody. So I'm sure you're all here listening in today because you believe in similar things too. So I'd encourage you all to get involved with our organization as members, partners, or both. So let's delve into setting some context for the discussion today. When it comes to federal housing policy, I think we can all agree that Canada is facing quite an uncertain future. Industry advocates were thrilled about the creation of the National Housing Strategy in 2017, but since we faced a number of challenges. To name a few of them, interest rates have risen significantly over the last year. We've seen construction and labor costs increase quite a bit, and we've also seen federal funding to create affordable housing go down. We're also looking at a strong possibility of a change in government in the near future. So what does all of that mean for our work to end the housing crisis? So, like I said, we are joined by a trio of powerhouses that have been vital in policy action, advocacy, and discourse on affordable housing in Canada. So let's introduce them. Our first panelist is Catherine McKenney. As Ottawa-based folks would know, Kat was a longtime city councillor for Ottawa's Somerset ward and a mayoral candidate in the city's most recent election. And they are now running the show at their relatively new nonprofit, City Shapes. Our second panelist is Tyler Meredith. Tyler held a number of high-profile economic policy roles with the Government of Canada and was a driving force in the creation of the National Housing Strategy. And more recently, Tyler co-founded his own firm, Meredith Bossenkool Policy Advisors. Tyler, I think I pronounced your business partner's name right, but there we go, points for me. And last but not least, we have Mike Moffat. Mike leads policy and innovation with the Smart Prosperity Institute, is an assistant professor at the Richard Ivey School of Business in London, Ontario. And Mike also has some of the best Twitter threads on housing that I've read recently. So kudos to you, Mike. So we only have an hour together today. We're already eating into that time a little bit, and we also have a few stimulating questions lined up already. So we might not have a ton of time to take questions from the audience, but nonetheless, let's hope that we can take some. So if you have anything you want to ask our panelists, please go ahead and type those questions in the Q&A section on the webinar control panel at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can. So without further ado, you've heard from me enough. Let's talk to our panelists. Let's kick off the discussion with you, Tyler. If you were designing the National Housing Strategy today instead of in 2017, what are two things that would look different?
Well, I think a couple of things. The first is probably you would be relying less on financing tools because the cost of financing has increased substantially. And if you remember in the National Housing Strategy, there is a big number of 60 or 70 billion dollars. A lot of that is actually just capital, right? It's access to capital and financing at low cost terms. And while that's helpful in an environment where interest rates have changed substantially, I think we need to rethink what the balance is between grants and loans. That would be one. I think the second thing is we definitely need to have more significant component associated with assisting nonprofit providers with the acquisition of land and the costs associated with land, because there's no question that that is one of the biggest inhibitors to being able to build supply. We have been able to build supply in, and Mike will probably add that we haven't been building it as fast enough, but we've been able to build supply in the market sector, but we haven't been building supply nearly as fast enough in the nonprofit sector. And part of that is because it's just very costly to put together projects, to find the land, to work with municipalities. We got a bit of a head start on that with the Rapid Housing Initiative during COVID, but I think we've got to build on that momentum and probably think more creatively and ambitiously about how we can do land banking and how governments at all levels, but particularly at the federal level, could be involved in using tools to actually drive development themselves.
Those are great points. Thank you, Tyler. Mike or Kat, did you want to jump in next?
I can go. Of course, Tyler took my number one. I have it right here. Change, need for an acquisition fund. Absolutely. We knew, I'm going to approach today's conversation from, a very municipal perspective. We saw a loss of affordable market housing at an alarming rate, really, in this city, in Ottawa, and in other cities as well. Some numbers suggest 7 to 1 back in, between 2010, 2016, that has grown. So, that need for an acquisition fund, as Tyler said, to make sure that we're not losing, for every new nonprofit affordable housing unit we build, we don't want to lose 7 or 15 because, it's like digging in sand, really. You're never going to be able to stem the flow of people into homelessness. And it does mean that, we'll get into this a little bit later, but, to end chronic homelessness, you have to stop people from falling in. And if people lose their market rental today in any large center, there's nowhere else for them to go. It's very, very difficult to find other affordable housing. And of course, getting into community housing or social housing is, at least a 10-year wait list, sometimes longer. So definitely the need for an acquisition fund to ensure that we start to stem that, loss of affordable market rental.
Yeah, and I just add to that, I tend to approach this from more of a 30,000 foot level, and I think one of the big issues with the NHS, or just the federal approach to housing in general, is that it's completely disconnected from the demand side. The demand side for rental housing is coming from population growth. Right now, in the last year, the biggest single component of population growth was international students. I defy you to find in the National Housing Strategy or all the analysis reports on the NHS, do a control F for international students. You won't find it. There's nothing in there about creating residences. So what happens is, because housing is a system, a lot of those affordable rentals are getting bought up and they're getting turned into student rentals. So there's just this disconnect about, where the demand is coming from on the rental side and the supply side approaches to it, that we've siloed everything off. And I think it's causing, particularly in mid-sized markets in Ontario, is causing a lot of the rent increases that we're seeing.
Can I just come in on that point? Because I think Mike raises an excellent point. And I think this goes to the heart of what is the National Housing Strategy. In its original structure, the National Housing Strategy was really a strategy for the Government of Canada as to how the Government of Canada could use its tools, primarily transfer tools, to preserve the existing stock of affordable housing that we had, that in the mid 2010s was starting to see the expiry of those mortgage subsidization agreements, so that we wouldn't lose that stock, and then potentially incrementally build on top of that. The National Housing Strategy did not, at that point in time in which it was created, think critically about, so what is the future population dynamics that we're going to get associated with immigration? And arguably that is an internal to government coordination problem, and they've got to figure that out. But the second part of it is, it's actually not a national housing strategy in the sense that, as I say, it's a Government of Canada housing strategy. Yeah. Because as Mike pointed out, what he pointed to in terms of international students is in some cases actually the byproduct of provincial governments not having invested sufficiently in post-secondary education. And if we want to move to a national housing strategy, we actually have to have provinces and the federal government working together to look at how all of the different tools that they have, be it PSE, be it immigration, be it municipal zoning and planning, how all of those pieces interconnect to housing issues, because all of these things are housing issues.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Tyler, just building off of that point, how do we do that? How do we get the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments to work together more effectively?
Well, I think part of it is actually having a more institutionalized forum for those ministers to work together. Not every provincial government has a minister of housing. We need to have clear lines of authority around who are ministers of housing that the federal government can deal with. And part of that may simply be to elevate the issue to ministers of finance, because at the end of the day, all of these things require financing, and they're all basic public finance questions. But I think it requires the federal government, starting from a position of saying, look, we have a common national challenge of how do we build more housing. We all actually now seem to agree, even the Ford government agrees on the notion that we need to build more, and we need to build more faster. But how we've integrated the plan to do that across our 3 levels of government, we haven't figured out. So whether this is something that the Council of Federation can pick up, whether this is something that a Minister of Finance's table can pick up, I would say that it's got to be elevated to those decision makers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the points, Tyler. Before we move on to another question, Mike or Pat, did you want to jump in response to that?
Well, I just want to add that, you know, when you look at, I think the most successful part of the response to the housing crisis, or homelessness at least, was the Rapid Housing Initiative that was introduced during the pandemic, where we just got the money in cities to build housing, and it will become supportive housing, which we know is what's absolutely required to end chronic homelessness. But at the same time, we didn't have, the province at the table at the same time talking about where those supports would come from. Those are the health dollars that we need. We can build the stock. You'd need different stock for different things, right? You need, rental stock for the general public. You need, affordable housing for those who, are not, middle-class income earners. You need social housing, community housing, and you need supportive housing for people who need those supports. And that does take both levels of government at the table. Maybe I'll just add that, in reaching home, if I could look back at the National Housing Strategy, I would ensure that one of the components that was required for reaching home funding is a housing first approach. We know that it works. We know it's actually the only program that works, and there's not that requirement anymore. So I go back to looking at what works on the ground, and I would hope to see that type of change moving forward.
Absolutely. Mike, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, so I agree that we need coordination. I mean, that's absolutely the case, but I think that lets the federal government off the hook a little bit. The federal government announces immigration targets with like 2 months notice. How are we supposed to, if we're adding 20,000 more people, how are we supposed to do that in 2 months? Right? There's no reason why they have to do that. They could announce 5 or 10-year targets and go, okay, this is our trajectory. Understanding that, governments change and new governments may have an approach. There's no reason why the number of international students has to be essentially, no cap on it. Right, we could set a cap, and that cap could be fairly high. I'm not suggesting we block out international students, but we could set these kinds of approaches. There's no reason why the government has to put HST on affordable rental. There's no reason why we can't have things like accelerated capital cost allowance provisions like we did back in the 1960s to build apartments. There's a lot of things that the federal government could unilaterally do on this. So I agree that we need coordination, but they do need to take a little bit of responsibility for some of these policy levers.
Absolutely. So that's a great segue into our next question. Does the National Housing Strategy need a reset? Does it need tweaks, or do we think it's mostly fine? And if we were to change things, how would we go about that? What's the right process? So Mike, maybe we'll start with you, just because you just finished off.
Well, I'll put it this way. So my hometown's London, Ontario. Rents in London, Ontario for a 1-bedroom apartment the day that the NHS was released was $900 for a 1-bedroom apartment. 5 years later, it was over $1,600. They went up 88%. If that's success, I'd hate to think what failure looks like. So no, this is absolutely not working at all. We are in a much worse place than we were the day that this was released. And I understand there's counterfactuals of going, okay, well, maybe we'd be even worse off if this didn't exist. But no, I think we need to do a whole rethink. And I think, and I would agree with Tyler that we need to tie in housing policy to things like education policy, to labor market policy. Because even if we had, all of the best reforms at the municipal level, we still need the people to build these homes, right? And it's one of the challenges we particularly see in the GTA is there's a big shortage of skilled tradespeople in the GTA, in part because nobody can afford to live in the GTA. So, we create these conundrums for ourselves. So I think we need to go back, look at this, go understand, the sort of root issues and address it that way. Because right now we have a grab bag of different policies that don't necessarily touch on the sort of the core issue. So no, I think we need a complete rethink on this, just because again, we can't go from $900 to about $1,700 in 5 years for a rental. That's just that's not what success looks like.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. Tyler, I saw you unmuted yourself. Looks like you have a lot to say.
Look, I mean, I think we have to remember the fact that the national housing strategy, started from a place where there just was no active policy framework for the federal government in housing. So we've gone from zero to having something. Whether it is sufficient is a different question. And I think we would all agree that especially in part because of the federal government's choice to increase immigration levels, it has become insufficient over time. So the national housing strategy and the amount of money that was put into it originally was a function of what, at the time, in what was a much tighter fiscal environment, the government could afford in order to have meaningful impact. And I would argue the targets that were set in 2017, independent of what was happening with immigration, were still some pretty meaningful targets. Now, have we achieved everything on that front? No, but what I think is important is that if you look over the course of time since 2017, virtually every successive budget since then has invested more money in housing. So you've got clearly the attention of the federal government to want to continue to do more, and in effect has been resetting the national housing strategy as it goes because of those continuous investments. What it doesn't have is a sense of the level of ambition that's needed. So provinces generally, plus the federal government, agree now on the point that there needs to be a certain amount of new housing built over the course of the next 10 years in order to fulfill the supply demand, in order to address the supply demand imbalance that exists in the housing market. What we don't have is the scale of or the full policy suite in order to meet those objectives. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to basically convene the provinces and the federal government together to figure out, so if we say we're going to build 2.5 million homes over the next 5 to 10 years, how are we going to do that? What is the actual set of policy measures that are required to do that? And then acknowledge that in the interim, there is going to be, even if we can get to that run rate of construction, it's going to take time to get there. We can't just overnight increase the run rate within either the market or the not-for-profit segments of the housing market. So what are we going to do? How are we going to help people who are still in a too expensive market, especially on the rental side? And I think that's where we need to ask ourselves, is there something in the interim that we should be doing with the Canada Housing Benefit that could be scaled or redesigned in a certain way in order to better assist low-income households who are in the market that are on a long waiting list for affordable housing and are probably 8 to 10 years away from getting a unit? And we have very successful models that exist in places like Manitoba and now starting in British Columbia of how you could expand a rent supplement program out to a broad number of households. And the fact that we created the Canada Housing Benefit in the last year, I think provides an opening to have that discussion about, is there a need for a targeted transfer in this area?
Thank you for your points, Tyler. Kat?
Yeah, so let me jump in there. I'm going to say, whether it needs a reset or just, start all over. I look back at the two main goals of the National Housing Strategy, to end chronic homelessness. I think it started at 50%, but I think we can all agree that we can end chronic homelessness, and then to reduce what's called core housing need by 50%. So core housing need, for the most part, people living in rental accommodation that they can't afford. So what you've got is on the one side, You know, to end chronic homelessness, again, you need more social housing, but you also need some more supportive housing. You need those supports. You need that good housing first model, if you will. It's what works. We see it. We see it in this city. We see it in other cities where people are pulled out of homelessness. They've been there for over 6 months, often 1, 2, 3, many years. They have some, you know, so often they will have addictions, mental health issues, but we're able to house people with that, you know, high fidelity housing first model. So, you know, all you have to do is look at your numbers in any city. If you take a city like Ottawa, and the number is approximately 500-600 people who are chronically homeless. So we know how many units of supportive housing and or scattered units in the community that we require. So you build, say, half of those, and then you support people in the community. So you need rental supports to do that. So you need a very robust, you know, housing allowance program to be able to do that. Then on the other hand, for people who are living in housing that they simply can't afford, that is who's falling into homelessness. So every day we do take people out of homelessness and we house them, but more people fall in, and they fall in because so many people are in core housing need. Again, in this city, it's, you know, approximately 38,000 who don't, you know, their units are adequate size, they're in good state of repair, they just can't afford them. So again, it's you know, it's best to have much more community housing over the long term. That is how you ensure that people for whom the market doesn't work can stay in their housing. But in the interim, let's just keep them in housing, and that means giving people the support that they need to do that. The financial support. We know that it costs about what, $7,000 a month to keep someone in a shelter. When a family falls into homelessness, it's, you know, $3,000, $4,000, sometimes $6,000 a month to keep them in motel rooms. Let's just make those rental allowances available so that they don't get to that point. And then we can reinvest that money that we're spending on shelter.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add, and I'm going to become the international student whisperer. Non-permanent residents, generally speaking, are not eligible for those subsidies. So that's where we're getting, you know, the biggest housing needs, and we have all of these cash programs that they're not eligible for. They're not eligible for the CHB. So temporary foreign workers, refugees, international students are often not, you know, not eligible for cash programs, despite the fact that they're often most likely to be in core housing need.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all really great points. What I think I'm hearing from the three of you, in differing tones with coming at it from different perspectives, is that we need some sort of refreshed national housing strategy. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but that's what I'm hearing. So the question is, how do we resource and deliver that? And whichever one of you wants to jump in first, go ahead.
Not my expertise. I'm going to let the others go and mop up.
Mike, do you want to take a start at it, and I'll come in?
Sure. Well, in my view, I think we need to step back and trying to figure out what we're trying to accomplish. You know, and again, look at where those needs are the biggest, and understand what are the bottlenecks to getting that supply. You know, is it just an issue of cash? Is it a cash issue of labor? But I also think we have to go back to the point about speed. Like, what can we do at the federal government to speed? Like, if you've got a builder who wants to go to CMHC with a project, and they want to build a 6-story affordable walk-up, you know, maybe one in Etobicoke, one in Scarborough, they have to treat those. They have to get those. You know, could be identical buildings. The CMHC is going to treat those as a unicorn, and it's going to be 2 different processes, same thing like that, to you know, to get things like MLI Select and other things. We should, you know, the federal government can do things about that to say, okay, how can we focus on speed? Back when we had wartime housing, there was sort of a catalog of buildings out there where you could go and say, okay, I'm going to build this, and then boom, you're automatically eligible for these things. There's no sort of long-winded approval process. Looking at that, because I fear we're getting into this Canadian thing where we're so obsessed about measuring inputs, how much money, how much this, how much that. Instead, we really got to be focusing on outputs, and that output is and not just number of units, but how quickly can they get up. And I think if we start to take an output focused approach, we can go, okay, well, why is this stuff taking so long? We're going to notice all of these little barriers. So I don't, yes, do we need more money in this? Yeah, probably. But, I don't think just sort of doubling the amount of money into a broken system is going to accomplish all that much.
But can I just build on that point? Because I agree that we need to move to an outputs-based structure. And I agree that we've got to try to align incentives across levels of government. That's why I actually think something like the Housing Accelerator Fund, in concept, maybe not in practice, but in concept, is actually a really important innovation, because what it says is, you get this bucket of cash, municipalities, if you do these things that will accelerate supply, right? Which we all know we need to do. And let's admit, amongst ourselves, municipalities are sometimes part of the problem, right? Don't get me wrong, the municipalities are not adequately resourced sometimes to do this work, but the planning decisions that they make are part of the problem in some cases. And if we're going to change the incentive structure across governments, I think one thing we should be thinking about creatively is, how can the federal government move more of its programs towards this outcomes-based kind of incentive structure, right? And it could be even with conditional grants on the provinces too, because the provinces need, in order to frankly unleash municipalities to do what is necessary, the provinces also have to make a bunch of reforms. So I would look at that as one area. The second I would say is, we need to try to change the discourse away from being a question, as Mike says, about what's the total amount of cash that we put into the system. Because if all we do is we say, okay, that the 5-year mark of the National Housing Strategy, we're going to revise it, and it's going to take $20 billion more effort. And if we just put $20 billion more in, it will somehow be solved. It will not actually lead to the systemic change that we need, but it also, frankly, will not lead to the kind of decision-making process that we need, because it will become a function of what the fiscal framework can afford at that given moment in time. And if people think that the National Housing Strategy was under-resourced in 2017, it was because that, it was a tight fiscal environment in 2017, right? There was literally no economic growth that was happening at that time, because Canada was still recovering from a commodities recession. So how can we move the discourse away from a single cash injection at a moment in time towards something that's more systemic? One way to do that might be to actually say, let's set targets. Let's set a target that says 0.5% of provincial budgets and federal budgets will be dedicated on an ongoing basis towards this thing. So that as the rest of the denominator of government grows, you have an ability to make sure that we're keeping up, right? And that's important, because to the earlier point about immigration is what has been pushing up, for the most part, the denominator of nominal GDP, right? So if you push up overall government spending as a function of more people being in Canada, then we need to make sure that we're allocating an equivalent amount of more investment in housing in order to keep up with the demand in the system. So those are, that's not the entirety of the solution, but I think we need to be thinking in that direction, as opposed to, it's just a deficiency of X number of dollars.
Let me jump in, because I agree that cities do have a responsibility, absolutely, and in a couple of ways. One, I don't believe that most cities, municipalities have really defined the problem and the solutions and what the output should be. Clearly, I haven't seen it. I think that we need to know, what are the numbers? Like, what do you need? What do you need to stop people from falling into homelessness, to lower that core housing need? What are the units that you need, et cetera, and how are you going to allocate the that funding? But there was actually a very good report that was put out to Ottawa City Council by the Ottawa Alliance to End Homelessness. It was authored by Carolyn Weitzman, called "Scaling Up Nonprofit Housing." And honestly, it was the most exciting thing I've read in a long time. I'll be honest with you. it's, it's clear, but two of the things that really are critical. I mean, obviously we need, clear definitions of affordability. Everybody is, understanding that now. We can't, base our affordability on market rates. But we also, and obviously, reforming municipal zoning is an absolute must. We should not have single family exclusionary zones in any city. It doesn't make sense. There's nothing wrong with having a triplex beside you, or 9-story wood frame building, not 9-story, 9-unit rather, wood frame building on a corner lot in your neighborhood. We've got to reform zoning, and we've got to make the process function better. Doesn't mean that people shouldn't be consulted. Doesn't mean that we can't work together to make sure that what we get produces great little neighborhoods, but we do have to improve. But the key thing that cities can do is unlock the land that they own. Now, we had a task force in 2018. Plug myself there. It was my motion that formed it. But that task force came back, and what it did was it showed us 21 pieces of land owned by the city that was at or in very close vicinity to rapid transit, to our new our LRT and our bus rapid transit. So, we haven't unlocked that land, and land is a huge part of the cost. So we've got to start thinking about responsibilities at every level of government, but land, unlocking land, developing a land trust so that land is held in perpetuity. I'm living here in a townhouse in Breton Flats phase 1. Actually, it's across Albert, and it's CMHC owned land. It's publicly owned land. It's it was built as affordable in the time. Affordable ownership isn't anymore, but there are ways of ensuring that we have affordable rental on public land forever, so that that gap of affordability just keeps growing, so that and we've seen that with cooperative housing, for example, that when you build it, it might be it might not be a whole lot less expensive than market, but as time goes on and you take the market, the profit out of it, housing becomes more affordable. And unlocking land, I think, is key, and that's where cities can show leadership.
Absolutely. Those are all great points. Before we move on to another one of the questions that we had, more focusing on political aspects of this conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the output-based thinking that we've been referencing in this last question. I think it makes a lot of sense, but I also remember reading one of Mike's great Twitter threads, where, Mike, you mentioned that we need approximately $3 trillion to create the housing that we need to meet demand. So how do we actually resource that? Like right now, the national housing strategy is valued at around $89 billion. So like what proportion should come from government? Like what else could we do to actually meet that gap?
Yeah, well, I like Tyler's thinking of, okay, let's set a percentage of GDP, but I think ultimately we're going to have to figure out how to unlock more private capital. I think that's ultimately the way to do that. But you can create sort of incentives in place to achieve certain outcomes, whether they be affordability, net zero, what have you. That's in programs like MLI Select. So those things exist, but we're gonna have to figure out how to get private capital in here, and that's again just one of the shortages. We also have to deal with the labor side and things like that. But this is going to be a challenge. How are we going to come up with the trillions of dollars we're going to need just in the next 10 years in order to get the 5.8 million homes that CMHC says we need to get deep affordability?
So I would make 2 points. One is just building off of that I think we need to, one, think about whether there are tools that we can use that will create the incentive to develop more quickly. So one of those could be, do you develop a kind of a coordinated national approach to vacancy tax? Not that I think that we should necessarily be taxing housing more, but I just think that we want to encourage the replenishment and the reuse of those available either stock or land for development. And we should think about how to do that. And some municipalities and some provinces have already started to do that in a pretty interesting way. So I would look at how that tool could be deployed. I would also say that we need to think about this on the housing side as in the same way that we're thinking about the kind of reorientation of industrial strategy. In the sense that one of the things that has become quite successful, especially in the United States with the development of the Inflation Reduction Act, is the notion of production subsidies, right? So that a developer, if they're building a manufacturing plant or anything that's relevant within the eligible activities of the IRA, knows if I do X, I will be able to count and bank on a certain degree of subsidy, and I can just go and build my project. I think we need to consider whether there is a way to do that within well-defined eligibility criteria for affordability on the purpose-built market rental side, right? So Mike talked about some tax tools that you could use. Those might be helpful, and one of the advantages of the tax system is that it means if you meet the criteria, you can just proceed. And I think we need to get out of this kind of grant-based model of some of the ways we run programs. But I think in principle we have to think in the same very creative way in housing as we are starting to do in the industrial space. Because to be honest, and this is where I think the key political point needs to be made, we will not be successful with any of the other economic goals that we have as a country if we are not able to deliver an affordable housing market, because we have put a big bet on attracting and retaining talent here and developing talent. The future of Canada is clearly in its human capital, but that human capital is not going to stay here and is not going to be effectively used if they can't access affordable shelter.
And I'll add on to that, they are big numbers. Certainly here in the city, we asked for that number and we got it. It was, alarming to see over $2 billion number to meet those goals of the National Housing Strategy to end chronic homelessness and reduce core housing need. However, if we don't start now, it's going to get worse. Like, how many of us would like to go back to 2017 today, right? Like it's, here we are today, 2023, and, we have to make sure that we move forward and I do believe quite strongly that we can end chronic homelessness in this country. There's absolutely no reason why not. Homelessness as a whole will take more. But when you look at the money, and again, I'm not coming at this from an overall housing supply, that's been answered by Mike and most partly by Tyler as well. But if you look at homelessness and that what it costs in terms of health dollars, in terms of emergency response, in terms of shelter, it's millions and millions of dollars that cities spend every year just in keeping people sheltered. And today, and maybe I'll keep this for the political question, but today, as we're staring down growing encampments in our communities, I worry that we're going to start reinvesting in shelters as a short-term solution. And it is so much more expensive than just simply housing people. Of course, we have to build that housing, and that's where the labor shortage comes in, and the unaffordability of construction today is very difficult. But go back to land that is publicly owned and make it available for anyone who is not for profit and going to build affordable housing, truly affordable housing.
Yeah, so I would agree with all that, particularly we have so many surface level parking lots owned by municipalities. Why don't, instead of taxing vacant units, can we tax those and try and get some municipalities to build some housing on those? So yeah, I agree with all this. And, I think Tyler's approach is the right one. We can use the very same tools that we use to build the VW battery plant in St. Thomas to build homes in London. And that's essentially, what the tax provisions we had back in the 1960s were, with the accelerated capital cost allowance on purpose-built rentals. So it's not really that new a set of tools. We used them 50 or 60 years ago. They got a lot of apartments built. We can use them again, and I think we'd have to tweak them for the 2023 context. But the more we can make these tools just be automatic, because once anything goes through a grant process from CMHC and what have you, you're adding years onto this. And I think that's, if there's any takeaway I have from all of this is we need to move from subjectivity to objectivity, just and not worry so much about, okay, well, some of these projects aren't going to be perfect. We let perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to housing. And I think it's a real problem in Canada.
Absolutely. Those are all fantastic points. I want to switch gears a little bit to talk more about the uncertainty of the political environment that we're facing over the next year, maybe 2 years, we'll see. But it's looking very possible that Pierre Poilievre becomes prime minister, maybe a year from now, less, a little bit more, who knows? But if he does become prime minister, he's bringing with him a very different approach to politics and policy. So how can we successfully navigate this uncertain political environment when we don't know where we're going? Maybe I'll let Tyler kick this one off.
So look, I mean, I would say that Pierre has very successfully owned the housing issue because he has met the moment in terms of the emotional importance and urgency in the way that he's talked. And even if we can get our leaders to acknowledge that, that would be an important first step forward. So I give him credit for talking about this in the sense with the sense of urgency that I think it requires. Where I think Pierre falls down is that the actual elements of the plan that he has aren't really all that different from what others are talking about, and frankly are if anything less than what governments are themselves provincially and federally already doing. I mean, governments are already looking at how to tie infrastructure funding more directly to housing and transit, and so I think he needs a bit of a push on the substance. The useful thing though is that in his shadow cabinet, Scott Aitchison is probably one of the smartest people I've ever met to talk to on housing. And I think that, he is someone who's done an admirable job of getting out and engaging with experts and trying to build a sense of what might work. All that to say, I don't exactly know where that would take the national housing strategy under Pierre, but I do think that, what Pierre has done usefully is he's shone a light on this in a way that frankly, I think some governments have been avoidant on.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Tyler. Mike or Kat, which one of you wants to jump in next?
Maybe I'll just quickly jump in here. I mean, there was a tweet, I believe it was this morning, that Pierre Poilievre put out that showed encampments in Kelowna, BC, and referred to it as looking like third world. So again, I would expect that would come with some substance of what a conservative government would do, because in a year or 2 years from now, the likelihood of encampments still being where they are or having grown is pretty real. The thing about encampments, in the field of housing, we used to often say, like, nobody's going to take this seriously. Nobody did this. We're talking about housing for the first time ever, maybe in the last 5-6 years. But, not until it hits the middle class, not until I have to worry that, one of my children might become homeless. Like, I'm not likely going to, but you don't know about your children, right? So once that starts to creep in, and then you have this very visual cue in your community, in your parks, of people sleeping in tents. And it does two things. It can evoke two things. It can evoke anger from, people who are housed, who feel their rights are being violated, or they're not able to get into their parks, or it can evoke some, deep sympathy and a demand for government to do something. So, as that starts to take root in communities, in cities, in smaller municipalities as well, there is going to be a need for any government to respond to. How are we going to, we have to, I think it was Adam Vaughan always said, you have to look down the rungs you know, at the same time or before you look up. And that is, I believe, something that any government's going to have to come to very serious terms with very, very soon.
Yeah, so I don't have too much to add to that, other than I think we should see the current moment as an opportunity. I really get the sense that all the parties, we mentioned the government and the Conservatives, but the NDP, the Green, and the Bloc as well, that there's an appetite out there for policy solutions. So I think we need to focus on, you know, how can we solve this, and what are some cost-effective ways of doing so. And as been pointed out many times in this discussion, you know, homelessness is quite expensive. I do really think that there are things that can pay for themselves, and you know, there are different sets of tools that might be more attractive to one side of the aisle or the other, but those tools exist. So I think we need to take the current moments, you know, advocate for good public policy, and you know, hope, and you know, through GR, you know, work with the parties and try to adopt these. So I don't necessarily see the potential of an election as necessarily a harmful thing. I actually see it as an opportunity to help all of the parties raise their games.
Thanks, Mike. Before we move on from this question, Pat, Tyler, did you want to add anything else? Okay, so let's move on to our last question. We might be able to get to some from the audience, maybe not. Sorry to anybody in the audience if we don't get to your questions in advance. So I think one of the things that has kind of come out of this conversation is one of the motifs is that the housing crisis is worsening. And it's not because, you know, the national housing strategy was bad when it was created back in 2017, but needs have changed, among other things. So and like we've talked a little bit about this as well, but what are some new measures that you think should be enacted to tackle the challenge in its current form? And Tyler, do you want to kick it off?
So I think we've talked about a bunch of these things. I mean, I would say one is we need an acquisition fund. Two is we need to move to developing tools that developers are able to use and just run with. Whether those are delivered through the tax system or another means, I'm agnostic, but I think we've got to move to kind of a production-based subsidy model for housing. Now, if we do that, we also have to have very clear standards around what is affordability and how are we defining that in terms of access to these programs. Because I think, as we found with the rental construction financing initiative, that definition of affordability was probably not deep enough, and we probably need to push on that front. I'd also say that I think we need to spend some time really examining what is the labor. Like what is the availability of labor within construction trades, and how are we able to drive innovation between the capital and labor stock within that area of the economy? Because the reality is we still kind of build homes and buildings pretty much the same way we did in the 1950s. It's not as technologically innovated as, say, auto manufacturing has become. And if we're going to succeed in speeding up the process of construction, which I think we all agree we need to do, that's an area that's ripe for a lot more innovation, and it needs a lot more attention from governments.
Absolutely.
Agreed. That's my answer.
Yeah, mine too. I would just I'd add one thing, though. I think that we really have to look back at the Rapid Housing Initiative and ensure that we keep repeating that, because I believe that it's going to have once those units are in the social housing market, we're going to see a reduction, a significant reduction in chronic homelessness in Ottawa for women, certainly Indigenous women. It could go almost towards ending it. So I think that, you know, we really need to take that, and we need to just keep building that type of social housing, community housing, and get people into it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So thankfully, we actually do have a little bit of time to take a couple questions from the audience. So let's start with one from our friend Milan from Housing Hub of New Brunswick. So how do we shift policy to reflect the recognition of housing as a right? And how do we solve for housing across the ecosystem as one challenge and not in silos like emergency, supportive, affordable, and market? Whichever one of you wants to jump in first.
I'll take a crack at that. I think about this a lot. And I still for myself don't have a great answer, but the National Housing Strategy did recognize UNDRIP and certainly we have a unique commitment to Indigenous people to ensure that they have a right to housing, right to the land. And our housing has got to be, progressively based on human rights based approach. And when we look at today, what's happening in shelters, what's happening with people sleeping outside, families losing their housing, I think we really have to turn that back and think clearly about what a human right to housing is. It wasn't that long ago. I think I'm older than everyone on this call. Well, maybe not in the participants, but I do remember a time when I needed community housing, and it took me 2 months to get into it. Without that, I would have fallen into homelessness. And today we are, a few decades later, where people who are losing their jobs, getting sick, falling on hard times, are falling into homelessness. And so a human rights-based approach is absolutely key to ensuring that we are progressively moving towards ending what has become not just an emergency, but quite frankly, a catastrophe in this country.
Housing is a human right. I think we all know that. I think the challenge that we face is how do we make that a binding constraint on policy action? And one solution to that is potentially to litigate these things in courts. I would argue I'm not sure that will create the kind of constructive space that governments need in order to do what is necessary, because I actually think it may distance government from action in the short term. But that's where I actually think if we can set a target and then we can make funding automatic in the case of, for example, what we were talking about in terms of production subsidies, that is probably the easiest way to actually bring effect to the notion of housing as a right, because what it will do is it will make the policy action effectively a statutory benefit, and it will make the policy action automatic. And that's really the basic problem that we face from a policy and public administration standpoint, is we keep looking at this issue, which is inherent to everything we need to accomplish on our economic agenda, as frankly a function of what can we afford at this moment in time.
Yeah, I would agree with all that.
Okay, we have time for one more question from Michael Bethke in the audience. Michael, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right. So Michael's question, at least this one, I think there might be a couple in here, but he's asking how we can treat the elimination of homelessness and tackling the housing crisis in the same way that our governments responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, where as we all remember, probably all too well, is that governments pulled out all the stops and like really responded very quickly and nimbly in a way that we don't often see governments respond. So maybe Tyler, I'll start with you because I see you like really thinking hard on this one.
Well, I mean, it's true that government can act with urgency and can innovate pretty substantially when faced with a problem. I think the challenge with housing is that it hasn't been as forefront of a problem until very recently. And so, one of the ways to think about that, back to the point that Mike mentioned at the beginning, knowing that immigration is inherent to some of the dynamics that we've seen in the housing market in the last number of years, I think we need to think about more, government should be thinking more about the notion of like, if we don't solve housing appropriately, then the immigration, all of the big bet that we placed in immigration as an economic tool, an economic lever for Canada's future will fall apart. And I think the more that we can, that linkage is made, it will actually spur government into action, because the reality is Canada needs more immigration. I know people will debate me on that point, but the reality is we do need more immigration, just because we are too small of a country, and demographically there are needs long term. So if we're going to do what we think is necessary on the demand side to bring more people in, then we have to solve it on the supply side. And I think if government knew that they put at risk the political acceptability of one if they don't deal with the other, then I think they will be incented properly to solve the housing problem.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tyler. Kat or Mike, did you want to jump in?
I'll just add that, we had an essential pilot program on guaranteed income through COVID, and we saw that people were able to keep their housing at a rate that hasn't happened in years. So again, it's, people are homeless because there's not enough affordable housing. People are not homeless because they have an addiction, because there are many people who are housed with addictions. People are not homeless because, they have a mental illness. There are many people with mental illness who are housed. Many people who previously lived in poverty who were housed. It is about a lack of affordability and a lack of income to pay for, for housing. Granted, there's an issue with supply. That's a whole other discussion. But, we did have that pilot. We saw what happened with the Rapid Housing Initiative, and we saw what happened with CERB when people had that guaranteed income. And that was the response. And I believe that it's a pilot that worked. And we have to look back and think about, and I hope Tyler's right, which I'm sure he is, because I think he always is, that, governments will respond. That once this starts to hit middle Canada, it will become something that will be responded to.
Absolutely. Mike, closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, I would agree with all that. And then this is going to be tough to deal with, and I don't say this to be a pessimist, but we have to look at the fact that in our parliament we have nearly 100 MPs who have investments in real estate. The median voter is actually made better off with higher home prices. That's the difference between now and the pandemic. If 2/3 of us were made better off by catching COVID, the response to the pandemic would have been a whole lot different. So, I think a dose of realism here is important. And that's not to suggest we can't solve the problem, but just thinking that we're going to wake up and the sort of median Canadian is going to treat this as a crisis. Unfortunately, that's probably not true. And again, when the biggest groups that are facing this issue are non-permanent residents, which have no voting rights in Canada. So, I think we're going to have to figure out how to solve this in a way that doesn't require us to treat all of this like a crisis, because I just don't see that happening. I don't think the average Canadian voter, they care about this issue, but I don't think they care about it at a crisis level like we did in the pandemic. And I just don't realistically see that happening. So I think we're going to have to find some other ways to solving this, because I don't think we're going to ever have that sense of urgency.
An unfortunate point to end on, but
yeah, sorry. We should have reordered the questions.
Yeah, but yeah, so I wish we had more time to discuss. I know we have 25 unanswered questions in the Q&A function in the webinar, but we only had an hour together, unfortunately. So we're going to have to wrap things up here. So thank you to everybody who joined us, and for Kat, Tyler, and Mike for all of your great insights on this topic. Hopefully we can have you back again sometime soon to discuss more of this. So for everybody here, if you love this session, you're going to love everything else that CHRA is doing too. So I'd highly encourage you all to check out our website and engage with us in some capacity, whether as members, partners, or both. But until then, wish all of you the best. Take care.